Hello, and welcome to UDL in 15 minutes, where educators discuss their experiences with UDL. I'm Louie Lord Nelson, UDL author and leader. Today, I'm talking with Ikram Sabti, the head of primary at the RS school in Algeria. Ikram will share how she transfers what she learned about UDL when teaching children to training her colleagues. Hello, Ikram. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Louis. It's wonderful to be here, and I'm looking forward to sharing some insights from my UDL journey and the work we've been doing with our staff and students.
Ah, wonderful, wonderful. So tell us about your teaching background and how were you introduced to UDL?
So, my name is Ikram Sabti, and I've been working in education for several years now, mainly international primary schools. I'm really passionate about inclusive education, about creating meaningful and learning environment where, all students can succeed. So, basically, my background is mainly in primary education and inclusive multilingual classrooms. At first, I started as most of us as a classroom teacher, then I became primary coordinator, and now I'm head of primary. I mean, the first thing I remember is my early years when I started and I came across UDL. So, over the years, I've come to see UDL not just as something we use in the classroom, but as a way of thinking. It's about learning, about people, and even about leadership. So, I remember that in my early years of teaching, and I was working really with diverse learners, different levels, different languages, different ways of engaging. So I first came across UDL during one of the trainings with Leah. And I remember I was like, wow, this is like really what good teaching looks like. And I asked her, how do we get there and how do we even reach this level? And her response was like, Ikram, you are already all of you, most of you doing that. That moment really stuck with me, and I started putting names to things that I was already doing. Then the more I dove deeper into the principles, the more I learned and the more I realized that it was not just set of strategies, but it was more of like a framework, a mindset that explains what good teaching really is. And that shifted how I planned my lessons, how I teach, and how I lead. So now that I moved to leadership as head of primary, I just realized that I'm doing basically the same thing now. I'm bringing my experience as a teacher into my work, and now not with kids, but with adults.
Yeah, so like you just said, you were in the classroom, you learned about UDL, but you didn't leave it behind when you became the head of primary. Uh, so let's start with the primary classroom setting, though. I know that at the RS school, it's a fully inclusive school. How did UDL help you reach all of your learners?
True. So in the classroom, one of the examples I often come back to is how I used to run our literacy lessons using the Daily Five framework, especially with the upper primary students. So in my class, I always had that mixed group, students, different levels, different spoken languages. Some were really advanced, while the others were still building these basic decoding skills. At the beginning, like many of the teachers, I found myself giving like same tasks, even if I was doing my best and trying to differentiate, of course. But then I noticed and quite quickly that the challenge was not always the thinking, but it was the way these tasks were structured or presented to our student. And I started working more with UDL, so I began redesigning those daily five stations more intentionally. Instead of one fixed instruction for everyone and all the student, I started more adapting the input based on each learner. Some students got more scaffolded instructions, some got extension challenges, and the other had visuals or audio support, depending on their needs. I also became more flexible with these activities themselves. So during reading responses, students were not only limited to just one format. There are those who chose to write their answers, some to record them. So it depends exactly, or let's say, based on the needs of these kids. So the goal stayed the same, but the pathway just changed. And what was really important for me, especially with the young learners, was keeping strong focus on encouragement and positive reinforcement. I made a point of celebrating the effort and the strategy and the progress, not just waiting for that correct answer. And I believe that that confidence that we try to put in these little students is exactly what unlocks the learning, especially in mixed ability classrooms. And what changed me, or what changed especially for me through UDL, is that I started to see this very clearly. What I was doing exactly for these students, trying to adapt the input, the process, and the output with this daily five structure. And this is exactly what I do now with the teachers, because adults are also learning differently. They do learn differently too. So when I give any instruction now to the teachers I work with, I always try to ask myself the same questions. How do I make this accessible? How do I create different entry points? And how do I give people space to engage and reflect in their own way? So really, I didn't leave UDL behind me when I left the classroom. I just applied the same principles to different group of learners with the same goal, making sure that everyone feels capable, supported, and able to succeed.
Wonderful, wonderful. I just have one clarifying question for listeners who aren't familiar with the daily five structure. That's just not a practice everybody uses. So, is there a brief way you can describe that? Because I think you did a great job of sharing how you shifted it, but I don't know that everyone knows what the base structure is of daily five.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. And that, yeah, true, not everyone is familiar with that. Daily
Mm.
Five, I would describe it as the framework that we use, especially at our school, for literacy, for teaching languages: French, Arabic, English. It's focused on five different stations where we are trying to build these different skills and abilities and competencies in when teaching the language. We have that listen to reading, word work on writing, read to someone, and read to self. So these different stations allow our student to learn and acquire new skills and competencies throughout their school years, and at the end of the school years we see really huge progress on how students changed and really mastered a new language.
I see.
Yeah.
So here's what I really appreciate about this specific part of our conversation, because there are a lot of people that would look at Daily Five and would say, oh, it's already different. They're listening to it at some station, they're decoding it at another station. The five stations are different, but you've pointed out that while the five stations were different, maybe in how the students perceived the information or accessed the information, you still needed to go back and redesign those so that you could support the different needs that your learners have in that classroom. That's how you were applying UDL. You were saying, I've noticed that listening at this station, there's still a barrier for some of my learners. So I need to change the station a little bit so that some of my learners have a different way to access the information. Am I saying that correctly?
Yes, true. That's it. Because when you are presenting work to one of the students, especially in the multilingual classrooms or students having completely different levels, redesigning or thinking of how we redesign the stations or the daily five and the activities we give our students using the UDL strategies really helped us.
Mhm. Now, I am gonna ask one more. So, like, at
Yeah.
that listening station, I think that's a really good example to help people understand. Because again, they think, "Oh, well, students are listening to either French or they're listening to Arabic or they're listening to English, what have you." But so how did you shift that particular station as an example?
So, one of the ways that we tried to shift, for example, the listening station is at first to assess and see the kids' needs, abilities, what do they know, what they don't know exactly, so that I can target exactly the support I can provide and, let's say, move these barriers and obstacles for them. So, if a kid is, let's say, at a beginner level, of course, I'm not gonna give them any type of activity that's gonna challenge them to the extreme or to push them to hate learning, especially when it comes, for example, to the Arabic language, where people often tend to see it as a very, very difficult language. So I try to make these activities really fun, engaging, and the level like exactly of my students can do.
Wonderful. I love how you talked about doing a little assessment first,
Yeah,
finding out what they need. You weren't just guessing, and then you were
yeah,
able to use that information to make the shifts necessary at that station. So
yeah,
thank you. Okay, so now we're gonna shift to staff,
yeah,
which is the direction we all thought we were going, but
yeah.
I just think people will really appreciate. Thank you so much. Okay,
You're welcome.
so what were some of the first UDL aligned techniques that you applied when working with staff? Were these used day to day or only reserved for training situations?
So, actually, when I started working with staff or teachers and colleagues, we had few shifts that we tried to do. So, when one of the first shifts that I made is was actually very simple. It was like more I stopped assuming that everyone would process the information in the same way, and I started seeing them the same way we do with our students in class. As teachers, like we have a lot on our plates. We're managing classrooms, planning, assessing, communicating with families, and responding to student needs every single day. So I realized if I wanted professional learning to actually stick, I needed to remove obstacles for teachers just as we do for students. So, for example, instead of presenting the information only through a training session, I started providing multiple ways for teachers to access and engage with it. I used checklists, step by step guides, and real classroom examples and opportunities for discussions and reflection. One example that comes to mind is that at the beginning of the school year, rather than simply explaining expectations for Google Classroom, we created a real model Google Classroom with real examples, resources, and materials, how lessons are supposed to be shared, what do we do and what do we put in our lesson plans, homework systems. So teacher could actually see what successful implementation looked like, explore it at their own pace, and of course ask questions during the follow-up check-ins that we do regularly. That model reduced the uncertainty and made expectations much clearer. I also changed how we use the classroom observation, treating them less as evaluation and more as coaching. After an observation, we would have that real constructive conversation where teachers could reflect, ask questions, and identify the next steps together, of course. And importantly, there wasn't something that was always like, or let's say, reserved for formal training days. It became part of our everyday leadership practice, whether it was a staff meeting, PD session, a coaching conversation, or even that quick interaction in the hallway. I tried to apply the UDL principles, the same thing that I used in my classroom, provide clarity. I try to offer the support, create multiple entry points, and respond to individual needs. I also really believe that relationships are a core part of UDL. Adults learn best when they feel respected, supported. So, alongside the structure and the resources, I focused on encouragement, positive reinforcement, and recognizing growth. Just as we want our student to feel capable and motivated, teachers need that same experience.
Ah, I'm so glad that this is recorded because I think people will be able to go back and listen to what you just said, and they'll just be able to create notes for themselves that they can follow because it was a great
Yeah,
recipe to help people take into their own environments and then shift as they need to, of course, because we know context is what matters. But it was just a
yeah.
great description. So I really appreciate that. So I imagine that the communication with staff is improved. For example, you're representing information in a variety of ways. And what are some other areas that are improved because you are applying UDL?
I think that communication definitely improved. And I do believe that it's because the information became more clearer, more accessible, and easier to act on. But honestly, I think that the impact goes much more deeper than just communication.
Mhm.
One of the biggest changes I've seen is in the professional culture where teachers experience UDL themselves. They begin to feel their individual strengths, perspectives, and needs are valued. That creates a culture in school where people are more willing to ask questions, share ideas, and even admit when they need support. I've also noticed an increase in teachers' confidence and agency. When expectations are clear, when resources are accessible, and when support is available through coaching and feedback, teachers feel more empowered to make decisions and try new approaches in their classrooms. They can be more creative now. And I believe that UDL helped us shift from a culture of compliance to a culture of learning. The conversation is just not like no longer about implementing strategies, it's about continuously asking ourselves as adults, as educators, how we can remove these educational challenges, support one another, and create better learning experiences for every student that we have in our classrooms. I often think that UDL didn't just change how we teach the student, it changed how we learn together as professionals too.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you said, creating that shift from a culture of compliance to a culture of learning, it's spoken a lot when we think about our young learners, but it's so important when we think about our adult learners. And like you've just said,
True.
our staff, our colleagues, we, all together, we are adult learners. So thank you, thank you, thank you for expressing that. And so I think I'm going to say it's my last question. We'll see. But what do you think has been the most difficult part of helping the staff continue their work with UDL? And then what are some things you've tried to keep that momentum going?
I think that one of the biggest challenges is mainly helping people move from understanding UDL as a framework to actually living it day
Mhm.
to day. Yeah. So when the teachers first learn about UDL, me myself included, I remember that like we usually feel like, oh, that's really interesting because the principle now makes sense to what we see in the classroom with our students. So, but the reality is that the teachers we know all are already managing a lot. So sometimes UDL can feel like, oh, it's one more thing on my plate and I have to do it. This is before understanding what is it exactly. So one of the things that I've learned is that if teachers see UDL as an additional work, it becomes difficult to sustain. So I've tried to help them see it differently, not as something extra, but as a lens through which we can make decisions about teaching and learning. And to keep that momentum going, I focused on making the work practical and manageable. Instead of asking teachers to redesign everything, we focus on these small, positive, intentional shifts that we can make daily. And of course, we celebrate the progress and share examples of what's already working and that can be used by everyone. I also found that coaching conversations and regular check ins are incredibly important. Those moments allow teachers to ask questions, reflect on challenges, and receive this individualized support. In many ways, it's like applying UDL to professional growth itself. What I mean by that is that we recognize that teachers are also variable learners and that they need different types of support at different times.
Mm.
Another strategy has been modeling. I mean, we model for our students in the classroom different things, let's say the routines at the beginning of the year. So, at the beginning also of the school year, we created like model resources, model Google Classroom, and concrete classroom observation sessions with experienced teachers, showcasing example of what successful implementation could like. So for example, new teachers that join us, they would go to these classes with those experienced teachers and try to see, observe. I had assistant teachers joining my class, and then I was giving them the chance to try to teach my students, and I would give them the feedback and try to help them see what's missing, what can be improved, and it's really positive environment that we try to create. So this leads to something else is that teachers are much more confident when they can see an example, really explore it and adapt it to their own context rather than just starting from a blank page and like, oh, here it is, you do it this way. So when someone experiences something, they would learn much more better. And I can always go back to that point is that I do really believe that relationships play a huge role in sustaining any educational change. People are more willing actually to take risks, try new approaches, and reflect on their practice when they feel supported rather than just judged or, oh no, that's wrong. You're not supposed to do it this way. No. So I think that's why I place a lot of importance on encouragement, constructive feedback, and recognizing growth along the way, because when you see the positive in everyone, they would give more, they would try more, they would like nonstop. So what keeps the momentum going for me is helping teachers see the impact, especially when they notice that students are more engaged, more independent, and more successful because barriers have been removed. UDL stops just being a framework for them that they have learned in a training or in the discussion, and it becomes more part of how they naturally think about teaching themselves. So for me, sustainability comes from consistency, support, and keeping the focus on the positive difference we're making for learners.
Hmm. So wonderful. There's two layers here that I was listening to and I'm hearing is you were talking about providing that positive and constructive feedback to the teachers as learners as a motivation, and then helping them to also look at the impact they've had on their learners and to
True.
investigate those positive outcomes. So it's looking for not just barriers, but it's also looking for where we've shed the light, where we have provided pathways for ourselves, for our learners, and then the pathways that you've helped create for your staff. And I think it's a fabulous way to think about the implementation of UDL because sometimes people get a little too stuck in the word of barriers and they start seeing that as an overload. And so you've provided a wonderful description of that light side that is not just fluff, it's really important, critical movement forward in education, but it's done through positivity. So I really appreciate that articulation.
Thank you so much. And if there's one thing I can change, I mean, I can add, is that I've learned this year from working with teachers is that any lasting change doesn't happen when people are told what to do exactly. It happens when they feel supported enough to grow and when they can clearly see the impact on the learners they serve in the classroom.
Absolutely. Oh, so much. That's just so wonderful. Thank you, Ikram. Thank you so much for coming on and being a guest and just clearly sharing this work that you've done to take how you applied UDL in your classroom to how you've applied UDL in the way that you're helping teachers move forward in how they learn about UDL and apply it themselves. So it's multi layered. Again, thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Louis. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. So, for those listening to this podcast, you can find supplemental materials like an image montage with closed captioning, a transcript, and an associated blog at my website, which is the udlapproach.com/podcasts. And finally, if you have a story to share about UDL implementation for UDL in 15 minutes, you can contact me through the udlapproach.com. And thanks to everyone for your work in revolutionizing education through UDL and making it our goal to support learner agency.